Souls-like games have gotten seriously competitive lately. Every year, new challengers come in trying to push the genre even further with tougher bosses, brutal combat, and non-stop pressure that can be incredibly frustrating, but incredibly rewarding once you finally overcome it. So with that said, let's get started.
Can't reach us.
Imagine. No more looking over your shoulder.
A place that's worth fighting for. No matter the cost.
Wuchang Fallen Feathers is one of the most interesting Souls-like games right now, mainly because it brings a completely different atmosphere compared to the usual dark medieval settings. The game takes place during the final years of the Ming Dynasty, where war, plague, and supernatural creatures have completely destroyed the land. You play as Wuchang, a pirate warrior suffering from a mysterious feathering disease that slowly transforms people into monsters. What makes it even better is how aggressive and stylish the combat feels. Instead of the slower pace seen in many Souls-likes, Wuchang pushes faster movement, martial arts-inspired attacks, weapon switching, and precise parries during fights. Boss battles also look absolutely brutal, especially with the game's mutation mechanics and supernatural abilities constantly changing how encounters play out.
My Emperor will not fall in vain. You are just another lost soul, trying to oppose fate. And fate is mine to command.
My lord, I have come for you. So the noble shinobi stands in our way.
Sekiro Shadows Die Twice still feels like one of the hardest but most rewarding games From Software has ever made. Rather than focusing on giant builds and RPG stats, the game throws players directly into intense sword fights where timing matters more than anything else. You play as Wolf, a shinobi trying to protect his young lord in a violent version of feudal Japan filled with war, assassins, and terrifying creatures hiding across the world. The reason Sekiro still stands out years later is because the combat completely changes how people approach Souls-like games. Dodging constantly usually gets you killed here. The game wants players to stay aggressive, parry attacks perfectly, break enemy posture, and fight head-on like an actual samurai duel. Once the combat finally clicks, every boss fight becomes insanely satisfying in a way very few action games can match.
Un plaire, je t'aime pourtant, ton amour ardent, pour rien je le sens, le courage est fait.
Lies of Peace surprised a lot of people because what first looked like just another Bloodborne clone ended up becoming one of the strongest Souls-like games in years. The game takes the story of Pinocchio and turns it into a dark, gothic nightmare set inside the city of Krat, where deadly puppets have wiped out most of humanity. What really helps the game stand out is how many unique systems it adds on top of the usual Souls-like structure. You can mix different weapon blades and handles together to create completely new weapon combinations, which gives players way more freedom than most games in the genre. The Legion arm system also changes combat in a huge way, giving Pinocchio different mechanical abilities like flamethrowers, grappling hooks, shields, cannons, and electric attacks depending on your build. Star Wars Jedi Survivor feels like one of the closest things to a modern Star Wars RPG mixed with Souls-like mechanics. The game follows Cal Kestis as he explores massive planets while trying to survive against the Empire several years after Fallen Order. Compared to the first game, everything here feels bigger, from the story and exploration to the amount of side content hidden across each world. One of the coolest additions is the expanded lightsaber stance system. Players can switch between multiple fighting styles, including dual wield, crossguard, blaster stance, and double-bladed combat, depending on the situation. Exploration is also much more open this time, with platforming, mounts, hidden chambers, upgrades, and optional bosses spread across huge areas that reward players for constantly revisiting locations.
Galaxy fall to this unworthy machine of an empire.
Hope may feel beyond our grasp. But I think we finally found somewhere the Empire can't reach us.
Imagine. No more looking over your shoulder.
Black Myth Wukong feels like one of the few Souls-like games that genuinely brings something fresh to the genre, instead of just copying Dark Souls. The game is heavily inspired by Journey to the West, and follows the Destined One as he searches for relics connected to Sun Wukong across a world filled with demons, gods, and mythological creatures from Chinese folklore. Visually, the game is insane. But what really carries it is how unique the systems are compared to most action RPGs. Instead of relying on dozens of weapon types, the game focuses deeply on Wukong's abilities, like transformations, spells, spirit summons, and different staff stances that completely change how fights play out. You can transform into defeated enemies, use magical abilities like immobilization, and build your character around very different playstyles without the game ever feeling overwhelming. Nioh 3 looks like Team Ninja taking everything from the previous games and making the series far more open and flexible than before. Instead of strictly linear missions again, the game now uses larger connected open field areas filled with side activities, yokai zones, and exploration mechanics, while still keeping that hardcore Nioh identity intact. One of the biggest additions is the ability to freely switch between samurai and ninja combat styles during battle. Samurai style focuses more on heavy stance-based combat, while ninja style is built around speed, evasive movement, and aggressive mobility. The game also expands character customization, vertical exploration, guardian spirit mechanics, and crucible realm challenges that push the difficulty even further for veteran players. Remnant 2 is the kind of Souls-like that keeps surprising players even dozens of hours later. At first, it looks like a normal co-op shooter with Dark Souls mechanics, but the deeper you get, the more you realize how different every playthrough can become. Entire worlds, bosses, and events can randomly change depending on your campaign generation, so players constantly discover things other people completely missed. Another thing that makes the game stand out is the archetype system. Instead of locking players into one class, Remnant 2 lets you combine different archetypes together and create weird hybrid builds. You can run around with a dog companion as the handler, switch into a heavy damage gunslinger setup, or use summoner abilities to fight alongside creatures during battles.
These warriors may. Their pain could be the foundation for a new age.
Wukong Fallen Dynasty feels like Team Ninja's answer to Sekiro, but with much heavier Chinese mythology and faster martial arts combat. The setting takes place during a dark fantasy version of the Three Kingdoms era, where legendary Chinese warriors and mythological creatures exist side by side. Instead of slowly exploring ruined castles like Dark Souls, the entire game has a much more chaotic, war-driven atmosphere, with battlefields, demons, and collapsing kingdoms everywhere you go. What really makes Wulong stand out is the morale system. Both you and enemies have morale ranks that directly affect difficulty during missions, so fights become riskier or easier depending on performance. The game also uses divine beasts that can heal, buff, revive, or unleash powerful attacks during battles, giving players much more strategic freedom than most Souls-likes.
Call us the new world order. Dare you to cross that border. Nobody can control us. Gon' make you lose your focus. And they know when you're passing me. There will be a catastrophe. Blasphemy, and you can stop your gassing me. Already know I'm the like your majesty, so bow down. So you wanna go toe to toe? Only way you're beating me is if I don't show. But I ain't going anywhere. Never left now, I'ma keep it right here. Maybe coming for the throne. Here we got them shit, I know you feel it in your bones. I don't wanna hear another single word coming at your mouth.
The Surge 2 takes Souls-like combat into a brutal sci-fi world where cities have collapsed under rogue technology and cybernetic violence. Instead of fighting knights and monsters, you're dealing with heavily armored soldiers, drones, exo-rigs, and machines that can tear you apart in seconds. The setting alone already gives the game a completely different identity compared to most Souls-likes. What makes the combat really satisfying is the limb targeting system. You can focus attacks on specific body parts to steal weapons, armor, or upgrades directly from enemies, so every fight feels rewarding beyond just gaining experience points. The game also gives players a lot more mobility than expected, with fast dodges, directional parries, drones, and larger interconnected areas that encourage exploration. Mortal Shell takes a much slower and heavier approach compared to most modern Souls-likes. The world feels completely dead and abandoned, almost like every location is hiding something ancient underneath it. Instead of creating your own character normally, you take control of different shells, which are basically fallen warriors with their own stats, abilities, and combat styles. Swapping between them changes the entire feel of the game depending on how aggressive or defensive you want to play. The game's signature feature is the hardening ability, where your character can instantly turn to stone in the middle of combat to absorb attacks. Mortal Shell also keeps its storytelling very mysterious, so exploring new areas feels more like piecing together fragments of a forgotten world rather than following a traditional RPG narrative.
The consecrated fires revealed cinders and shadows. But beneath it all, no monsters, no gods, only oblivion.
The first Berserker Khazan feels like a mix of Sekiro and Nioh, but with a much heavier and more brutal tone. The game follows Khazan, a legendary general betrayed by the empire he once served, and the entire story is basically built around revenge, war, and survival in a collapsing world. Visually, the anime-inspired art style gives it a very different identity from most Souls-likes, especially during boss fights where everything feels incredibly violent and over the top. Fights are heavily focused on perfect timing, stamina control, and staying aggressive under pressure. Some bosses barely give players room to breathe, especially once the game starts mixing huge attack chains with fast counters and delayed strikes. Khazan can also switch between different weapon styles and unlock powerful abilities that completely change how encounters feel depending on your build.
かつて人であった者たちがわずかな血を求めてさまよう愛の花。ここはよどんだ血の牢獄。ベイン。
Code Vein takes the Souls-like formula and pushes it into a much more story-driven anime direction. The game follows revenants, vampire-like survivors living in a ruined world where blood is required to stay alive. Compared to most Souls-likes, Code Vein spends way more time building relationships between characters, which honestly gives the journey a very different atmosphere from the lonely feeling usually found in the genre. One of the coolest parts is how freely players can change their playstyle. Instead of being locked into one class, you can swap abilities and builds constantly depending on the situation. The game also lets players travel with AI companions who actively fight alongside you, revive you during difficult battles, and make exploration feel less isolated than most Souls-like games. Lords of the Fallen feels like a much darker and more modern take on the classic Dark Souls formula. The game throws players into a brutal world ruled by the demon god Adir, where ruined kingdoms, gigantic monsters, and twisted religious factions are constantly at war. The Umbral Lamp changes exploration completely because players can shift between the world of the living and the world of the dead almost any time they want. Sometimes the only way forward is by entering Umbral, but staying there too long becomes increasingly dangerous as stronger enemies begin hunting you down. The game also adds soul-flaying abilities, co-op progression, ranged combat that feels way smoother than older Souls-likes, and a huge amount of build variety through magic, heavy weapons, agility setups, and status effects.
Now you will know darkness, brother.
You are in the presence of a god-human.
Immortal or not,
And for forgiveness.
the gods will feel our blades.
Bloodborne completely changed the way people saw Souls-like combat. The game takes you into the city of Yharnam, a place consumed by disease, madness, and terrifying creatures that only get worse the deeper you go into the story. At first, it feels like a dark, gothic monster hunting game, but as you keep playing, it slowly turns into full cosmic horror in a way that still surprises new players even today. Instead of rewarding defensive play, Bloodborne pushes aggression through the rally feature, allowing players to recover lost health by immediately striking enemies back. The trick weapons also add a huge amount of variety, since weapons can transform mid-combat into entirely different forms. That's why fights against bosses like Father Gascoigne, Ludwig, or Lady Maria still stand among the most iconic encounters From Software has ever created. Elden Ring took the Souls-like formula and expanded it into a massive open world filled with secrets in every direction. The Lands Between is absolutely packed with hidden dungeons, underground cities, optional bosses, and areas many players completely missed during their first playthrough. One of the best parts about the game is how naturally exploration works. You're constantly getting distracted by something interesting on the horizon, then suddenly realizing you've spent hours going somewhere the game never even told you to visit. The amount of freedom players have is also a huge part of why Elden Ring became so successful. The game supports almost every playstyle imaginable, whether you want to use giant weapons, powerful sorceries, dragon abilities, or spirit summons during difficult fights.
Be born.
well, a lowly tarnished, playing as a lord.